Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to those of you who were here for the morning session. For those of you who don't know, my name is Danny Postel. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and it is my distinct honor to introduce this second and final session of our day-long symposium on U.S. foreign policy after the Iran nuclear deal and the changing geopolitics of the Middle East, which is a co-production, I should say, of our Center for Middle East Studies here at the Joseph Corbell School and our partner, the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies at the University of South Florida, whose executive director, Mohsen Milani, many of you heard this morning. He was the keynote speaker on our opening session. He will be a panelist on this session, which I will now say a couple of words about. But again, I just want to emphasize that this is, although we are doing this here at the Corbell School, this really is a joint effort between our two institutions in an open-ended, long-term partnership that we're so proud to be involved with. So our keynote speaker on this session, which is titled U.S. Policy, the Saudi-Iranian Rivalry and the Changing Geopolitics of the Middle East, our keynote speaker is Professor Gregory Gause, who is a professor of international affairs and head of the International Affairs Department at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. He is the author of several books, including The International Relations of the Persian Gulf, which is available for sale. I should say, let me just call attention to the fact that we have lots of books on sale in the back, including Ambassador Christopher Hill's memoir, which is available in both paperback and hardcover. Those two editions have slightly different subtitles, by the way, constantly keeping us on our toes. The paperback edition of Ambassador Hill's book, the book is titled Outpost, A Diplomat at Work. That's the subtitle for the paperback edition. Professor Gauss's book, The International Relations of the Persian Gulf, is also available for sale. He's also the author of Oil Monarchies, Domestic and Security Challenges in the Arab Gulf States, and Saudi-Yemeni Relations, Domestic Structures and Foreign Influence. He has also penned a pamphlet titled Saudi Arabia in the New Middle East, a very slender but concise volume published by the Council on Foreign Relations, and that is also available for sale. So this is how this session will work. Professor Gause will show the PowerPoint presentation that you see queued up here, and then we will have a panel discussion with Professor Gause as well as Ambassador Gary Grappo, who is a distinguished fellow of our Center for Middle East Studies, and Mohsen Milani. For those of you who don't know, let me just tell you a little bit about Ambassador Gary Grappo, who is a distinguished fellow of our Center for Middle East Studies here at DU. He is the former U.S. ambassador to Oman, the former charge d'affaires and deputy chief of mission in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, minister counselor for political affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, where he worked with Ambassador Hill, director of regional affairs for the State Department's Near East Bureau, and he also served as envoy and the head of mission for the Quartet in Jerusalem. So, this will be another spirited and lively discussion, I'm sure, which will now begin with a kickoff presentation by Professor Gause.
Oh, a clicker. How nice. Howdy. Did I get any howdies, any Aggies out there? At Texas A&M, we begin all our talks by saying howdy. It's a way to get everybody quiet. There's talking before, you just say howdy. You get a howdy back and everybody's quiet. But I guess here in sophisticated urban Denver, you know, you don't have those kinds of traditions. But you know, from College Station, a big howdy. Even though the Bush School of Government and Public Service and the Korbel School are, well, let's just say competitors. We're fishing in the same pond for students. We're trying to place our students in the same kinds of jobs. You know, I'm extremely happy to visit the campus of one of our peer institutions. So, on to the Middle East, what I'm calling the new Middle East Cold War. So the title in your program is, as Danny said, U.S. policy, Saudi-Iranian rivalry, and the changing geopolitics of the Middle East. I want to start from that last one because I don't think that we can understand either the Saudi-Iranian rivalry or U.S. policy without understanding what I see as the changing geopolitics of the region, right? And I think that the best way to think of this is as a Cold War. And I will, hopefully it will become clear why as I go on. So this is a region in crisis, right? So that crisis goes all the way from Libya, where we have a civil war going on right now, through parts of Egypt, like in Sinai, where it appears that governance has broken down, in the Palestinian territories in Gaza and the West Bank, and this is not an Arab-Israeli thing, governance within the Palestinian territories, right? The conflict between Fatah and Hamas, right? Lebanon, we haven't had effective central governance since the 1970s, if we ever had it. Civil war in Syria, lack of effective governance in Iraq, civil war in Yemen, and if we extend it out, a lack of effective governance in Afghanistan. I would say that the main characteristic of this regional crisis is either the weakening or the collapse of state authority in so many parts of the greater Middle East. Right? The origins of this crisis, I would argue, are very, very much in this breakdown of authority. Now, we talked in the morning session, for those of you who are here, will be a little bit of a review. The way that this conflict, the way that this crisis is frequently presented is as a Sunni-Shia conflict. And our friend down here, I think he's Muhsin's cousin, General Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds force in Iran, is someone who has been able to affect the politics of these places where state authority is broken down. But we're going to get to that in a second. Is the best way to think of this as a Sunni-Shia conflict? I would say no, right? In the same way that we talked about this morning. This regional crisis affects places where there are no sectarian conflicts. Everyone in Libya is a Sunni Muslim, okay? But they're fighting each other, right? They're fighting each other over other things, regionalism, ideology, right? In the Sinai, in Palestine, there are no sectarian differences driving politics, but this conflict, this sense of the lack of governance and the fight over what legitimate government means continues. And of course, sectarianism exists in Afghanistan, but it's not the real driver of the conflict in Afghanistan. The Shia minority in Afghanistan is relatively small and isn't a major player in the contest for power. It's also, of course, an oversimplification. We talked about Kurds today. Kurds are not a sectarian group. They're an ethno-linguistic nationalist group. They've got Sunni Kurds and Shia Kurds, but their Kurdish identity trumps their sectarian identity, right? Lebanese Christians are divided, right? Some Lebanese Christians supporting Hezbollah and that coalition in Lebanon, other Lebanese Christians supporting the Sunni-led March 14th coalition, right? Both the Saudis and the Iranians try to downplay in many ways the sectarianism of the conflict, right? Although Ambassador Hill will tell you that Iyad Alawi is not, really a good Shia, the Saudis backed Iyad Alawi's Iraqiya party in the Iraqi elections of 2005 and 2010, even though Iyad Alawi is a Shia. Now, he wasn't representing sectarian Shia political interests, but if sectarianism is the driver and Sunnis hate Shia, then the Saudis wouldn't have backed Iyad Alawi. And finally, I'll talk about this later, there are tensions within the Sunni community, So I don't think, like Mohsen, I don't think that the best way to understand this is as a sectarian conflict. So but sectarianism is real, right? Sectarianism is real. I'm going to skip over this because extra points, who's that? That's Gamal Abdel Nasser. I call this the new Middle East Cold War because there was an Arab Cold War, right, in the 50s and 60s. A book that I still make my students read, The Arab Cold War, another great book about the time, the struggle for Syria. The Arab Cold War is written by Malcolm Kerr, who is probably best known now as the father of Steve Kerr, the coach of the Golden State Warriors, right? But at the time, Malcolm Kerr was one of the leading names in the study of Middle East politics, assassinated in 1983 in Lebanon, where he was president of the American University of Beirut, probably by Hezbollah, okay? Probably by Hezbollah. But how did Gamal Abdel Nasser get powerful? He got powerful because he had an idea, Arab nationalism. He found followers in the weak states of Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Iraq that helped to foment political change in those places, right? The one time Nasser tried to use his army to advance his interests in 1967, it was a disaster. The Israelis cleaned his clock in 6 days, less than 6 days, right? And when Nasser sent his army to Yemen to try to support some of his buddies who had overthrown the government in North Yemen, it became his Vietnam. He publicly said in an interview, Yemen is my Vietnam, right? So this is a new Middle East Cold War because we had an old Middle East Cold War. And that Cold War was not about armies clashing in conventional warfare. It was about trying to take advantage of the political weakness in the domestic politics of Arab states in order to try to advance your cause. Now, there's some similarities. We don't have a whole lot of time. I want to emphasize the domestic bases of this new Middle East Cold War. As I said, it's the weakness or the breakdown of state authority that invites regional intervention, right? The Saudis and the Iranians don't have to fight their way into Syria. The Saudis and the Iranians don't have to fight their way into Iraq or Yemen. They are invited in by the parties because the parties in these places are fighting civil wars for power. And they're looking for the money, the guns, the political support that they can get from outside powers. And it's natural that Shia would look to Iran for that support. It's natural that Sunnis would look to the most powerful and richest Sunni state, which isn't Egypt anymore. No, it's Saudi Arabia. Or to Turkey, where some groups have looked for support. That sectarianism is not a top-down phenomenon. It's not imposed on this conflict by Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's actually a bottom-up phenomenon. When political authority breaks down, people look to the communities where they will be safe, where their basic needs will be taken care of. For historical reasons that we don't have time to discuss, in many of these states, those communities are sectarian because of the particular histories of Lebanon and Syria and Iraq. In other places, as I said, sectarianism is irrelevant, but people look to other communities for safety and security. When the state can no longer provide the basic requisites of what a state is supposed to do, security, basic needs, people will look to their sub-state communities where they find their security safeguarded, okay? Now, the weakness or breakdown of state authority, didn't start with the Arab Spring. Yemen and Lebanon they've been historically weak states, right? And there's been intervention in Lebanese politics forever. There's been intervention in Yemeni politics forever, mostly by the Saudis, but not always. The Egyptians were involved, the Soviets were involved, all sorts of people were involved, but most consistently the Saudis. So Lebanon and Yemen were always weak states, and there was always foreign intervention in their politics. But then in 2003, the United States invaded Iraq in probably the most counterproductive American foreign policy decision, certainly since Vietnam. Some people would say even longer back, okay? what the United States did in 2003 is it took a weak regime, right? A regime that was tottering because of international sanctions and its own stupidity in engaging in foreign adventures, and it knocked it over. And the United States, as a matter of policy, chose to destroy the Iraqi state. We destroyed the three bases of the modern third world authoritarian state. We outlawed the ruling party, right? We limited the ability of people who were members of that party to serve in the bureaucracy, thus gutting the bureaucracy, and we disbanded the army. So you take those three legs of the modern authoritarian state, and in an act of hubris, we thought that we could rebuild the Iraqi state from the ground up. We failed, right? And as a result of that, Iraq, which had been a player in Middle Eastern politics, became a playing field in which outsiders were invited in by Iraqi groups who were looking for support in the contest for power. And of course, Iran was the most successful of those groups. In Palestine in 2007, Fatah and Hamas had their split, which opened up another avenue for Iran and Saudi Arabia to intervene in politics, to be invited to intervene in politics. And then the Arab Spring happened, right? And the Arab Spring made Libya and Syria, which had been relatively stable, autocratic, not nice people. Gaddafi, the Assad family, these are not nice people, right? But they governed these places, some cases misgoverned, but they governed these places, right? With the Arab Spring and the collapse of authority and the beginning of civil wars, these places became playing fields for outsiders to be invited in to play out their balance of power games, right? Yemen, an already weak state, collapses into civil war. And then in Egypt, we see kind of encapsulated the tensions within the Sunni world during the Arab Spring. With General Sisi and President Morsi, I said they're in happier days, see how happy they are. They actually don't look that happy, right? But this contrast between democratic, populist, Sunni Islamism, the Muslim Brotherhood, versus slightly more secular nationalist Egyptian identity represented by the army. So what we're seeing is the collapse of state authority or the weakening of state authority in so many parts of the Arab world. And this generates sectarianism. As I said, from the bottom up, not the top down. This is a funeral in Baghdad for a militia, people who were killed in a Shia militia called Sa'ib al-Haq. And of course, these guys here on the bottom are ISIS guys. The growth of these militias is only possible where the state collapses. If the state is still in charge, you're not going to see militias formed because the state will crush them as a challenge to its authority. This weakening of the state, I would argue, reversed a decades-long process of state strengthening in the Arab world. That's a whole other topic we can get into in questions if you're interested. So why is it that Iran is doing so well in this new Middle East Cold War? Well, I basically think that there are three reasons, right? First off, it does have these Shia connections. Right? The collapse of the state in Iraq, a place with a Shia Arab majority. The collapse of the state in Lebanon, a place with a Shia Arab plurality, not a majority, but a plurality among the various sectarian groups in Lebanon. This created opportunities because these groups looked to Iran for support. Iran had also, as Mohsen had mentioned in the morning, played to this axis of resistance idea, right? This idea that that the Iranian regime put forward that we're the only Middle Eastern state still standing up to Israel. And they're right, because the Arab states had basically all made their peace with Israel, either formally like Egypt and Jordan, or informally like the Saudis, and even Hafez al-Assad Syria, which came darn close to a peace treaty with Israel in 2000, right? So the Iranians have these connections, right? The connection to the state-to-state alliance with Syria that Mohsen had talked about, the axis of resistance appeal, the Shia connections, they have that. Right? The Iranians have money. Not as much as the Saudis, but they have money. Because what do you need if you're putting together a militia? What do you need if you're engaged in a civil war? You need money. You need guns that money can buy, right? So the Iranians have money. They also have loyal allies. They have allies committed to them for ideological and institutional reasons. Hezbollah being, of course, the most prominent, and here's some Hezbollah guys lining up for a parade, right? Mohsen said this morning that Hezbollah was the greatest success, right? You said it was the greatest success of Iranian foreign policy in the post-revolutionary period. I agree with him. Hezbollah is an asset the Iranians can use not only in Lebanon, but against Israel, and now we see in Syria. Right? The Iranians can use Asa'ib al-Haq in Syria, other Iraqi militias. Even Afghan Shia have been recruited to go fight in Syria. The Iranians have loyal allies, and they have their own forces, the Quds Force, which they can deploy strategically into these areas to assist the groups that they're supporting. So the Iranians are great patrons if you're a client. They are very good patrons. They're there to help you. They're helping you with their own forces, they're helping you with money and guns, and they're helping you with loyal allies who can come to your assistance. Now, Saudi Arabia sees Syria and Yemen as the best chances for them to roll back Iranian influence in the Arab world, which is why the Saudis are so engaged in both of those places. Just well, you guys all know about the Middle East. You know where the Shia are and all. Here's our trivia question. Second trivia question. Who's that guy? Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, right? Who's that guy? No, Khalid Mashal, head of Hamas, outside of Palestine, right? Who's that guy? Ambassador Hill, who's that guy? Yeah, that's former Prime Minister Maliki, right? Who's that guy? Bashar al-Assad. All of them with the supreme leader, their patron. Right? So what about the Saudis? There's the new young prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who is the most powerful man in Saudi Arabia right now, who's basically running lots of the shows. So why are the Saudis not doing as well as the Iranians are in this new Middle East Cold War? It's not because of money. They've got plenty of money. They got more money than Iran has. Lots more money than Iran has. It isn't money. What the Saudis don't have is they don't have their own troops to deploy outside their borders, right? They don't have a Quds force. They don't have troops that they can send into Syria, send into Lebanon, send into Yemen even, to do their bidding. In fact, it's the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, that's trying to develop this kind of expeditionary force on the model of the Quds Force. Actually, a little less on the model of the Quds Force and more on the model of a real kind of expeditionary force, right? They're the ones who went into Yemen to fight against the Houthis. The Saudis flew air support for them. And there are Saudi troops in the northern parts of Yemen. But the Saudis can't use their own forces the way the Iranians can. But I think most importantly, the Saudis don't have reliable regional allies. There is no Hezbollah equivalent that Saudi Arabia can deploy confidently for its own purposes. The Saudis rent people. You can't buy people, you can only rent them, okay? And the Saudis rent people, but they don't have those people who are committed to them ideologically. In fact, their natural allies, their ideological allies in this struggle, hate them, right? Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, who are, as we talked about this morning, Salafis like the Saudis, have in many ways a similar interpretation of Islam as the Saudis. They hate the Saudis and want to kill them, right? So their natural allies, their natural ideological allies are not deployable by the Saudis, They're the enemies of the Saudis. I also want to emphasize the fact that thinking of this as a sectarian conflict masks really important divisions in the Sunni world. Right? That's Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey. That's King Salman of Saudi Arabia. You would assume if this were a Sunni-Shia fight that those guys would be on the same team. They would be natural allies. The two biggest Sunni countries in the Middle East, well, not the biggest, Egypt is bigger than Saudi, but the most powerful Arab Sunni country right now, Saudi Arabia, with the 80 million Turks, right? Turkey, powerful NATO army, NATO Air Force, relatively prosperous country after 10 years of good economic growth under Erdogan. In fact, these guys backed different parties in the Syrian civil war. They pursued contradictory policies for most of the Syrian civil war. It's just recently that the Saudis and the Turks have even begun to talk a bit, right, about cooperation on Syria, right? Erdogan saw the Muslim Brotherhood victories in Tunisia and Egypt as perhaps allowing him, also a populist, democratically elected Islamist politician, to become the leader of a bloc within the Middle East, right? And Turkey and Qatar, we can talk about the Qataris in questions. It's unfathomable to explain them. They supported the Muslim Brotherhood. The Saudis, of course, hate the Muslim Brotherhood because the last thing they want is populist, democratic Sunni Islamism, right? So the Saudis and the UAE have declared the Muslim Brotherhood an illegal organization, right? They supported the Saudis supported the Free Syrian Army in Syria, then the Salafis. They supported General Sisi in his coup against the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt, right? Pouring tens of billions of dollars into Egypt, right? Which is just like me taking my wallet and throwing all my money off of that balcony right there for all the good it does, right? Of course, the UAE and Saudi also directly intervened militarily in Yemen against the Houthis, who are... So the Houthis, again, we don't have enough time to go into the long history of the Houthis. In fact, I'm coming close to where I should stop talking. Let's just say my soundbite on this is the Houthis want to be Iran's clients more than Iran wants to be the Houthis' patron. Right? So the Houthis are enthusiastic pro-Iranians, and the Iranians are kind of, oh, we don't know about these guys, and Yemen, what's that worth? But of course, with the Houthis throwing themselves at Tehran, why not throw them a little money, give them some support? This, of course, drives the Saudis crazy. And when the Houthis made their move down to Sana'a and then toward Aden, the UAE and the Saudis intervened militarily. But the key issue here is that if this is a sectarian war, right, the Sunnis don't have their act together. There are divisions within the Sunni world that are as serious, right, as the competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia. All right. So what about the U.S. in all of this? Right? What about the U.S. in this new Middle East Cold War? Well, first off, we have to acknowledge that the United States is better at state destroying than at state building. And if you want to get to the root causes of this regional crisis, right? The root cause, if you've bought what I'm selling so far, the root cause of this is the weakening or collapse of state authority. And so the solution to this problem is the rebuilding of states. We don't have much, the United States, we don't have much to offer on that score. We don't have much to offer. We are not going to go in militarily and do it for people. And even when we did go in militarily in Iraq, we didn't have a good idea of what we were doing and how to do it, right? The road to state building is not only bumpy, it's foggy, right? You got no idea where you're going. We don't have a good model of this, which I think, bodes very ill for the region. I think that we could come back 10 years from now and be talking about the very same dynamics, unfortunately, because state building is hard. And this crisis is not going to end until you see the reconstruction of state authority in the region. So, one of the things that our friends in the Middle East, like the Saudis and the Israelis, complain about is America's inconsistent. We're inconsistent in our policies in the region. And that is absolutely right, right? That is absolutely right. We are against a Shia, an Alawi Shia government in Syria supported by Iran. We are against that government, and we are supporting, at least nominally, some of the groups opposed to that government. In Iraq, we are in favor of a Shia government in Baghdad supported by Iran, and we are against the rebels fighting against it. We're inconsistent. We don't fall into this Sunni Shia classification because we don't care. We don't care about this Sunni Shia thing, right? This administration, this guy's administration, which I think he thinks is over, but still has a number of months to run. That was a joke. I think he thinks it's over because he gave this interview that Muslim likes so much to Jeffrey Goldberg. That's the kind of interview you give with 3 weeks left in your term, not 8 months left in your term, where you insult all your allies. I mean, I don't disagree with Muslim. I think I agreed with a lot of the things that President Obama said. I just don't know why you say it months and months and months before you leave office. Right, there we go. And saying those things like 3 weeks before you have a trip scheduled to both Saudi Arabia and Britain, 2 of the countries he insulted as free riders on the American alliance. I don't get it. I don't get it. In any event, this administration had another agenda, and we heard about it this morning. They wanted a nuclear deal with Iran, and they got it, and I think that was a good thing. But this administration also wants to limit Iranian regional influence, and not just because of relations with Saudi Arabia, but also because of relations with Israel, right? And because I think the grand strategy of the United States has always been to prevent any one power from becoming dominant in the Middle East, except for us. Except for us, right? So we oppose Salafi jihadism too. Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, we oppose them, right? So we oppose Syria's Assad, but we also oppose the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, which is why we're kind of paralyzed by what to do in Syria. Muslim's absolutely right. I think that this administration refuses to take a stronger stance in Syria because they don't know who's going to succeed the Assad government, and they don't want it the way he doesn't want it, and I don't want it, and I assume almost everybody here doesn't want the government in Damascus to be ruled by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and the Islamic State. Right? And the fact of the matter is that the regional balance of power is just not as important to the U.S. as it is to the local players. Syria is not as important to the U.S. as it is to Saudi Arabia and Iran and Turkey. It's just not as important. So yes, from the point of view of the regional actors, we have an inconsistent foreign policy in the Middle East. Right? But I think that there's a logic to it, right? If we understand American foreign policy in terms not of the definition of interest that Middle Easterners have, either the Iranians or the Saudis or the Israelis, right? But if you understand it in terms of the goals that this president wanted to achieve, I think that he's done an okay job. An okay job. Not great, and watching the sausage being made here is not edifying, right? The whole red line and then backing away from the red line, that's horrible tactical diplomacy, even if you think that he ended up in the right place. Right? So I think that, that this administration, right, has played this new Middle East Cold War about, I don't want to say as well as you possibly could, but it's played it okay. The next administration is going to have plenty of opportunity to deal with this because the problems that we've been talking about today are not going away. So, what should we put up? We'll put a map up. How's that? Because it's always fun to look at maps. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to my fellow panelists.
Thank you very much. So, thank you to Professor Gause for reminding us why we thought to invite you here as the keynote speaker for our second session. This is exactly the sort of expertise that you bring to bear on this issue, and I think you have provided excellent food for thought as a point of departure for the discussion that will follow. So, I mean, it's always interesting. One of the great things about working in a school of international studies is that you have both academic political scientists and international relations theorists like Professor Gause, and you have actual practitioners like Ambassadors Hill and Grappo. So, Ambassador Grappo, let me turn first to you. What is your take on some of the issues that Professor Gause has laid out here, especially in terms of the U.S. policy piece? It's a pretty broad question, but I'm just trying to kick it over to you because I have a feeling that you have a lot to offer by way of someone who actually did this for many, many years in this region.
One particular point that Professor Gause made that is absolutely correct, and that is in the region, the United States has always wanted to be dominant power. Sounds as though we wanted to control it, and that's certainly not the case. But we certainly wanted to be the major power, and we did not ever want to see anyone diminishing that power. And we were sort of thrust in this position after World War II, where we were basically the only power standing. The previous global powers, such as Great Britain, France, to a lesser extent Germany and Japan, were destroyed, or their economic systems were set back 10, if not more years behind. And so all of a sudden we found the Middle East right on our desk. And we were not very prepared for it. Most of the activities we were involved in the Middle East revolved around missionary work and oil. And it became very clear after World War II that oil was going to be a determining and critical factor in the future of economic progress, not only for the United States, but all of our allies around the world. And so we had to ensure that the oil did not come under the control of another country. And after the Cold War, we didn't have to worry so much about competition. And today, we pretty much still maintain the role of the leading power in the region. What has complicated it now is non-state actors basically moving into the very cracks that Professor Gause alluded to when governing institutions break down. That was something else we didn't have a whole lot of experience with, nor did anyone else. And so we were sort of bereft of tools, other than, of course, the big hammer of our military. Diplomacy in dealing with a lot of these extremist groups is ineffective to date anyway, since the United States nor any other country negotiates with terrorists. I can't say not any country. Some groups we would consider to be terrorists, other countries do not, and therefore they negotiate with them, i.e. the Russians with Hamas. So we are sort of, for lack of a better word, fumbling around in terms of how to deal with this region that has been thrown into this chaotic state to which Professor Gause alluded to. And of course, the two competing powers are probably the most inscrutable of all the countries in the Middle East, Iran and Saudi Arabia. Having served in Saudi Arabia which we often refer to within the State Department as the Magic Kingdom. It was because you were actually dealing with a very quiet state, the religious establishment, and then, of course, the ruling Saud. And what is interesting about Saudi Arabia and the influence of Wahhabism is that it's quiet. You don't see it, but it's very, very much there. And we're not very good at dealing with heavily religiously influenced governments. It's hard to negotiate religious issues with any individual, much less a government. So we have a government that's heavily influenced by religion and a particularly extremist version of religion. In the case of Iran, actually not altogether different, where religion, Shia Islam, plays a very significant role in that government. It's tough for the United States as a sectarian nation, and of course a secular nation and a secular government to come to terms with governments and nations that are so religiously driven. That is not to say that this is entirely a sectarian conflict, because sectarianism typically rises in times of conflict. In times of peace, you can look at any one of these countries and talk to individuals. Shia and Sunni families intermarry, they have friends, sometimes they even worship at one another's mosques. So if you think of it in, say, the American sense as racism, it's very, very different. Nevertheless, we do find demagogues, for example, Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, who are able to exploit sectarian tensions. And sectarian tensions do indeed exist. In Saudi Arabia especially, individual Saudis who've never met a Shia can actually be very hateful toward a Shia. Minority Shia who live there, we're talking about 1.5 to 2 million people, feel this every day. There are no Shia mosques in Saudi Arabia. They have Hussaniyas, which are kind of like meeting halls or community centers where they carry out worship, but there are no Shia mosques. And of course, there are no other churches or no other religious institutions of any kind in Saudi Arabia. And Iran tends to be much more tolerant, but nevertheless has a very strong Shia leadership. That's certainly not going to change in a Shia-dominant nation. So the United States is having to wrestle with something it really hasn't had any experience with, something is a fairly new phenomena in the world today, and in a region that where it's a relative newcomer compared to just about any other country in the world, certainly the countries who were there. So in the inconsistency that we've shown in the region shouldn't be surprising. The one consistency you will find is that we will ensure that no single power becomes dominant, certainly more dominant than we, and that the oil fields, even though we are less reliant on oil, that the oil fields do not fall in the under the control of any enemy country. And I think there's less concern for that second matter today, since oil has become such a critical commodity in the global economy, and it's a commodity. So politics are almost set aside when it comes to buying and selling of oil. In terms of looking forward, the new administration is going to have to address this colossal humanitarian problem of Syria. I mean, even the Iranians and others, the Russians, virtually every country in the world wants to see more attention given to resolving this crisis, and at the very least, to stop the hemorrhaging of Syrians, We've got over half the country now is either displaced or a refugee. And you have an economy that has been decimated, probably half the size it was before the Civil War. And of course, depending on whose estimate you want to believe, something approaching 300,000 lives lost, which actually dwarfs what happened during the Lebanese Civil War of the 70s.
Some estimates have it at 400,000.
And
Or
some
higher.
estimates, yeah, up to 400. Whatever it is, it's a staggering figure for such a small country. And adding that to the number of displaced people or refugees. So that's going to be probably one of the first challenges that the new administration is going to have to face, and having to do it without the military hammer or tool is going to be very, very difficult. Rallying support around the world for whatever is decided is going to be very difficult, and ultimately deciding the fate of Bashar al-Assad. Before his use of chemical weapons, I would have said, cut a deal. Go in there and cut a deal. He wants to stay. He represents a stabilizing institution, i.e. the Syrian government, which does function, and then go from there and negotiate something. Once he used the chemical weapons, I think, to use the phrase, we crossed the red line, and it's going to be very difficult for us to accept Assad, but we may have to, given the fact, as the two gentlemen on my flanks have said, there is no alternative in Syria today.
Well, thank you for those comments, Ambassador Grappo. Let me ask all three of you a question about getting back to the Iran nuclear deal for a second. Despite what Mark Lynch calls the supercharged atmosphere of crisis and recrimination, which is to say basically the Saudi and other Gulf states' complaints about the U.S. cutting this deal with Iran. Despite that, Mark Lynch argues that actually the Saudis are the big winners of the Iran nuclear deal. Now, that might sound counterintuitive because of their very angry statements about the deal and of the tilt of U.S. policy towards Iran in their view. But this is what he means specifically. He says the Saudis have won in the aftermath of the Iran nuclear deal on many important issues. The Saudi side of the ledger includes Obama's willingness to turn a blind eye to the sectarian repression of Bahrain's uprising, support for an obviously doomed and devastating war in Yemen, billions of dollars in arms sales, and grudging acceptance of the Gulf-backed military coup in Egypt. Let's just focus for a second on the Yemeni case. We can talk about others, but Greg, you've written a whole book on Saudi-Yemeni relations. I know that you took issue with some of Mark Lynch's arguments, but what do you make of this notion that the Saudis have actually, the noise that they've made notwithstanding, actually done quite well, and that there may have been a different U.S. policy, let's say absent the need for payback or to accommodate Saudi concerns? Might U.S. policy on Yemen have been different?
I think Yemen is the only place where policy, I think, would have been different. I mean, the crushing of the popular revolt, revolt's the wrong word, of the popular demonstrations in Bahrain predated the Iran nuclear deal.
But it was all, the Obama administration was committed to the deal, and the Saudis were already freaked out about it.
In 2011?
Obama ran on the idea of negotiations with Iran. In fact, it was one of his main points of distinction with Hillary Clinton in 2008.
I won't disagree with you on that, but I think we were a long way from the deal in 2011. The Bahraini thing had more to do with the fact that the Fifth Fleet is there, I think. I think that the billions of dollars in arms sales, that's not post-Iran nuclear deal. That's been since the 1970s. And the backing for the coup in Egypt, even absent Saudi support for that coup, it's hard for me to see an American government taking an active position against a government in Cairo that is committed to maintaining the peace treaty with Israel, that's committed to maintaining our military access to the Suez Canal and overflight. I don't see the Saudi angle here having much to do with any of those things except the Yemen.
Yeah, I agree. That's the most salient
Except the Yemen
case.
thing. And there I do think that the United States, the Obama administration, did provide the Saudis with logistical support, in-flight refueling of the Saudi Air Force, that kind of thing, largely because it wanted to kind of throw the Saudis a bone in the aftermath of the Iran nuclear deal. Now, how does one characterize the Saudi Emirati intervention in Yemen? Mark said that it's doomed to failure. It's led to significant civilian casualties, probably 5,000. Compared to Syria, but 5,000 people dead that probably shouldn't be dead, and that's awful. I'm actually surprised that the Saudis and the Emiratis have done as well as they have militarily. I didn't think they'd be able to fight their way out of Aden, because these are not armies that have engaged in combat. The fact that they've pushed the Houthis back up towards Sana'a, I think, has created at least the possibility of negotiations. Now, whether those negotiations work out, they're going on in Kuwait right now. And there was a Houthi delegation in Riyadh 2 weeks ago. So they're feeling each other out on this. And let's remember, the Saudis don't have any problem dealing with Zaydi Shia. The Houthis are Zaydi Shia. They're not the Twelvers that are the dominant Shia sect. The grandfathers of the Houthis are the guys that the Saudis backed against the Egyptian army in the 1960s. So it's not as if the Saudis can't deal with Zaydi Shia. So we'll see if there's some kind of solution, diplomatic solution here. So I think from the Saudi point of view, the Yemen intervention has not been as successful as they wanted, but wasn't a disaster, and now they're looking for the exit ramp.
Mohsen Milani, we'd like to hear from you on several of these questions.
This morning, you said that you would agree with 90% of what I said, and you would disagree with 10%. I agree with 96 or 7% of what you said, but I want to add a few points that I think could clarify some confusion for myself. To begin with, I agree with you that Saudi Arabia is losing the Cold War with Iran. I don't think they have scored a decisive victory against Iran anywhere. And this business that they're doing well in Yemen, I think is an illusion. They're spending, ladies and gentlemen, $200 million a day. And
It's okay. Keep going.
And 5,000 Yemenis have been killed, and there is famine. A lot of people have been injured, became homeless, and I don't see any way in which the Saudis can achieve their strategic goal of eliminating the Houthis. Iran doesn't have any vital national interest in Yemen. The Islamic Republic doesn't have any vital national interest. But thanks to the Saudis, Iran now has become a major player, a big player in Yemen. And elsewhere, they're losing. Where I disagree with you is on some of the points why I think they're losing this battle. The first one is that I believe, for good or bad, Iran represents a revolutionary regime. A regime that combines elements of representative government with repressive elements of Islam. But nonetheless, there is a popular side to the Islamic Republic. And the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979 was, without a doubt, the only revolution in the Middle East and the most popular revolution of the modern time. So the Iranian regime does represent something. I'm sorry, Saudi Arabia represents a family, represent a monarchical system. So when there was an uprising in the Middle East, they were on the opposite side of historical march. And that's why they're having a tough time winning in the Middle East. It's not because they're not spending enough money, they are. they essentially control much of the media of the Arab world. Look at every major media outlet. They are either controlled by the Saudis or by the Qataris or by the UAE. They're getting support from the Americans. They're getting support from the Western world. And despite all of this, they haven't been able to score a single victory against Iran. So they represent the past. But I think Iran can become, if they make some changes, to present a model that some countries can emulate. The second point about your discussion, which is not a criticism of what you said, but perhaps you could add that element to the Cold War, is the struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia for the control of oil and oil production. Because ultimately, power is about distribution of who gets what and how much. And oil is the determining factor. And these two countries have always been on different sides of the oil equation. The third point about Saudi Arabia, and that's where I disagree with Mark Lynch. The reason why the Saudis are so pissed off about this nuclear deal is not that they don't like the nuclear deal. I think they like the nuclear deal. What they don't like is the possibility of a rapprochement between Iran and the United States or Iran and the West. There are countries in the Middle East that have thrived on the animosity between Iran and the United States. And they want to keep it that way. And the reason is very simple. Imagine you're sitting in Riyadh and you're looking at the geopolitical map of the Middle East. What do you think is going to happen if there is a rapprochement, genuine rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia? Iran has a larger population and has greater potential. And the Saudis do not want to go back to the 1970s when it was the Shah of Iran who became the policeman of the Persian Gulf. That's the next one is that where I disagree with you is you said the Saudis don't have any allies. I think they do. The problem is their allies have the same problems that they do. They have the Gulf Cooperation Council. United Arab Emirates is an ally of Saudi Arabia. Bahrain has essentially become a proxy of Saudi Arabia. So they do have allies. The problem is that their allies have the same problem that they do. And finally, my last point is something that is taking place that perhaps you can address this, is that the Saudis are trying to become the leader, the new leader of the anti-Iran coalition in the Middle East. So the question I have for you, having said all of this, do you think they're going to succeed in that? Having said all of this, I really think you gave an outstanding presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Greg, would you like to respond?
Sure. I mean, I think the last question is the most important one, right? Can the Saudis form an anti-Iranian alliance in the Middle East? And there, I think the answer is basically no. I hinted at some of this when I talked about the intra-Sunni tensions. The country that would be the most significant ally of Saudi Arabia in an anti-Iranian alliance regionally would be Turkey. But the Turks and the Saudis have, I think, a really difficult time in completely coordinating strategy because the Saudis worry about democratic Sunni populist Islamism. And that's what Erdogan represents. Or quasi-democratic, but certainly populist. And the Saudis have real problems with that. And I think Erdogan is, ambitious enough that he wants to be the leader. Why cede leadership to the Saudis? The other country that kind of forms a possible pole in an anti-Iranian alliance is Egypt. But Egypt has its own domestic problems and can't really act in a decisive way regionally. And finally, of course, the other potential serious regional ally, especially if you talk about military issues, is Israel, right? And there's been all sorts of talk about the Saudis and the Israelis dealing with each other under the table and all this, and I'm sure it's true. But given the politics of the region, the Saudis still cannot have an open, cooperative, political, military relationship with Israel. It's too dangerous for them in terms of their own domestic politics to be publicly identified with the Israelis. And so I think that it would be a really difficult thing for the Saudis. And, you know, so the Saudis have the Emiratis with them and they have the Bahrainis with them. Well, as you know, the Bahrainis are a burden. They're not a help, right? The Emiratis are a help, right? You know, they've got this, you know, aggressive foreign legion force that they send into Yemen, and they've got even more ready cash than the Saudis. So the Emiratis are a help. The Qataris are a thorn in their side. And both Kuwait and Oman, Kuwait has its own Shia community, but very well integrated into Kuwaiti politics. They're not going to take a strong sectarian anti-Iranian position. And the Omanis, as you pointed out, were the ones who facilitated the talks between Iran and the United States. Oman has had very correct relations with Tehran since the revolution. They've jointly managed the Strait of Hormuz. And the Omanis are not about to sign on to some quixotic anti-Iranian alliance because they have a very good working relationship with the Iranians.
I agree with everything.
Ambassador Grappo, did you want to chime in there as the former ambassador to Oman and someone who's spent so many years in that region?
The Omanis, for a long time, were a conduit between the United States and Iran, going back to at least President Clinton. They have been forced, as a small country, to have proper relations with both Saudi Arabia and Iran. Of course, during the Shah's time, they had extraordinarily close relations with Iran, and in fact, the relationship between Sultan Qaboos and the Shah were very close. The Shah had dispatched Iranian troops to southern Oman, known as the Dhofar, to help put down the Dhofar rebellion, which was a kind of a leftist rebellion, which was successfully put down shortly into his reign. And so when I would meet with the Omanis from the Sultana on down, they became a very rich source of information about what was happening inside Iran. And we'd be very honest with us about when would be a good time to approach them and when it would not be. Just before I left, in middle of 2009, the Sultan pulled me aside and said, "Now's the time. I'm going to go first, and I'm going to come back, and he's going to kind of try to light the fire under the Iranians to warm up a bit to the United States and then come back to the U.S. and hopefully start something." It took him another couple of years, 3 years maybe, and he eventually succeeded in doing it. Same thing in Yemen. They've been a constructive force within in the Yemen conflict, as well as in Syria, trying to find ways to bridge the different sides. They've had a difficult relationship with Saudi Arabia. The Sultan, again, shared a great story with me shortly after he came to power. He wanted to have academics, university professors, and so forth, particularly Omanis, to come back to the country. The country was quite backward when he took power in 1970. And he particularly invited Muslim professors. Well, he ended up welcoming quite a number of Saudis. And his intelligence sources and the tribal sheikhs and so forth started telling him they're starting to preach Wahhabi Islam. And so after about 12 months, he packed them all off, back to Saudi Arabia. He literally said, I put a little tag on them, no Wahhabis welcome. Jokingly, of course. But he was very wary of the Wahhabi influence creeping into Saudi Arabia, and the tendency then to inflame sectarian conflict, because we have three Muslim sects within Oman. The predominant Ibadis, who are virtually not present anywhere else. in the Middle East or the Muslim world, and then, of course, the Sunni, and then a small minority of Shia. I want to make one point about Saudi Arabia going forward, and that's not to minimize the many, many challenges that Iran is going to face internally. I'm certainly more familiar, however, with Saudi Arabia. First of all, we always wonder about the Saudi leadership and how stable the sort of succession program is going to be as we move forward. We've heard things about King Salman maybe suffering from dementia, and therefore of limited authority in his country, and therefore his son, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the deputy crown prince, making many of the decisions. The current crown prince, however, is Mohammed bin Nayef, who comes from the intelligence arena. And it's just not quite certain. Certainly, if he were to pass away very quickly, it would probably be bin Nayef, whom the United States knows extremely well and actually likes. Salman, bin Salman, the deputy crown prince, is someone we don't know well, only because well, the guy's pretty young. 30-something is what people say. But even more importantly than succession, because typically the Saud find a way to get it right, or at least to get something, and that is to deal with the increasing popular activism within Saudi Arabia. And that is new for them. And we've seen the reaction so far, and it has not been good. Saudis are some of the most active individuals in the Middle East now in social media. And the government is watching it and is clamping down very severely on those who it believes are stepping out of bounds, including this one fellow who is writing a blog criticizing, rightly so, Saudi Arabia's atrocious human rights record, and is now serving time in prison and has been subjected to the whippings and so forth. This is not going to go away. Saudi Arabia, although probably not as well educated as Iran, does have an increasingly educated society, including university educated, although those who go to school in Saudi Arabia, you could argue about the quality of that education. Many have come here to the United States to study. This activism is, I think, going to get more supercharged as we move forward and create a very difficult challenge, not necessarily to Saudi authority, but running Saudi Arabia. And finally, Saudi Arabia's dependence on oil. We're seeing now the astonishing decisions that they're having to make, including selling off shares of Saudi Aramco, imposing a VAT tax. Probably won't happen this year, maybe at the end of the year, but I don't know if it's going to happen real soon. A tax at the Gulf? They don't even know what the word is. And so these kinds of things are going to have political repercussions in Saudi society and how it responds to that in a country that has been so managed. Recall what I said earlier, by these two elements, the Saud family and the institution of Wahhabi Islam. Neither one of them, I think, has really come to grips with this new phenomena. And now without the money to provide the lubricant to kind of make things work, particularly if there is any opposition, they're going to face some pretty serious challenges going forward. And the confrontation with Iran, because it's not an existential confrontation, some Saudis may think so, but in fact it's not, are probably going to have to turn their attention more inward, which is what President Obama said, and less externally.
Let's take some questions.
A question to my good friend Mohsen Milani. It's always wonderful to have you here. You stated in your remarks on the panel that Iran represents a revolutionary populist sort of quasi-democratic sort of model for the region, while the Saudis represent just a family. I think that is a formulation that I think was valid maybe 10 years ago, but there's been significant changes where it no longer is valid. Since the revolution, Iran invested heavily in projecting an image in the Sunni world that they were a precisely as you formulated. They were a revolutionary populist force that were different from the rest of the regional dictators. They cared about the oppressed people of the region. But as a result of their investment in Syria post-Arab Spring, and a result of the role of Hezbollah in Syria, now Iran's view in the region is not, as you've stated, Iran now is viewed exactly as the Saudis have portrayed them since the beginning of a revolution. You talk to Sunnis in the region, Iran is viewed as a sectarian regional power backing this dictator, mass murderer in Damascus, and all of its soft power that it had accumulated, all of the goodwill. A public opinion poll in the Arab world in 2008 ranked Hassan Nasrallah and Ahmadinejad as the most popular leaders in the region. All of that has been flushed down the toilet. So Iran has paid a huge price here, and it'll continue to pay a huge price. So the formulation, I think, that you articulated is not as nice and tight as you has presented, and Iran is paying a huge image, whether it could resuscitate that. So I'd like to hear you comment on that, and I'd like to hear what the other members of the panel have to think about that development as well.
Before I answer that excellent question, since you've been talking about Iran and Saudi Arabia, and I see a lot of students here, let me just share with you a couple of important observations about Iran and Saudi Arabia that you need to know. Number one, in Iran today, there are somewhere between 600 to 1,000 churches throughout the country. Christians are free to worship who they want. Some of the nicest churches that you can find are in the city of Isfahan, in Tehran. As a matter of fact, about 2 blocks from where I was born. And I was born about 1 block from the American embassy, which was occupied by those delusional Iranian students 37 years ago. It was a beautiful church. So we have a large number of, some people estimate somewhere between 80 to 100,000 Christian Armenians living in peace in Iran. Furthermore, Iran has excellent relationship with the Republic of Armenia, which is a predominantly Christian country in the South Caucasus. As a matter of fact, in the war between Armenia, which is, as I said, a predominantly Christian country, and Azerbaijan, which is the only other country besides Iran that has more than 90% 12 are Shiites, Iran took the side of Armenia against their Shiite brethren. We also have a small community of Jews in Iran. I think somewhere between, they say, 18 to 20,000 of them are still in Iran. Many of them have left. There is no doubt discrimination against them, as there is discrimination against a lot of minorities, as there are discrimination against Muslims. It's not a democratic regime you have in Iran. But they also have their synagogue. They practice their religion. And most importantly, there are representatives of Christians, 2 of them, 1 representative of the Jewish community, and 1 representative of a Zoroastrian community presented in the Iranian parliament. That, I think, is of an important fact. Now, the comment that you made, Nader, I don't know what we had in that lunch. I'm much more mellow this afternoon than I usually am. I agree with 97% of what he said. I think you are, you probably are right. I honestly think you have an excellent point. I think Iranian support for Syria has diminished the attractiveness of Iran as a model. And I think the Saudi supported portrayal of Iran as a sectarian power, which I don't think Iran is. I think Saudi Arabia is a sectarian power. I think Iran wants to go beyond sectarianism. And the reason is very simple. The Shiites are only 20% of the Islamic world. Iran wants to become the leader of the entire world, entire Islamic world. And if you want to do that, you got to go beyond sectarianism. But having said all of this, I think you are right. Iran has lost some of its attractiveness. But having said that, there is still the ideal of the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Long after the French Revolution devoured its children, the ideals of the French Revolution were followed by people all over the world, including by the Iranians in the 19th century. That's 100 years after the end of the French Revolution. So I agree with you that some of the attractiveness of the Iranian model has been lost, but I think it can be recovered. But most importantly, the ideals that were presented in the Iranian Revolution of 1979, I still believe is very popular in the Islamic world. And I guarantee you, once this business of sectarianism, once the dust settles, that model becomes even more attractive.
Did either Greg or Gary want to chime in at all on that? Okay, let's take an, Greg, did you? Okay, let's take another question then.
How does the role of the EU or Russia influence this conversation this afternoon?
Say none at all. I think we tend to exaggerate Russian power because of its role in Syria. I think Russia is a declining power. I think that it has as many domestic problems with the collapse of oil prices as any Middle Eastern oil-producing state. And we have to remember, for Russia, Syria is a hold. It's not a win. The Assad regime was really the only kind of state-to-state ally Russia had left in the Arab world, because the Russians can't provide much to people. And you know, the fact that Russia has participated in helping prop up the Assad regime, I don't see as a great success for Russian power. I mean, I see it as a desperate attempt to hold on to one of its few remaining footholds in the Middle East. I mean, I think you can think of Ukraine in the same way, frankly. I mean, you know, to me, that's not an exertion of Russian power. It's a desperate attempt to hold on to some element of Russian influence in an area that, for centuries, Russia had ruled directly, both the Russian Empire and then its successor with the Soviet Empire. So I see Russia as a declining power, and frankly, not that significant. And the EU is, I'll disagree somewhat with Mohsen here. I think I'm ruining, yeah, because the baklava is worn off. Bring me more baklava and I'll agree with him. I think that having the EU involved in the sanctions was extremely important, because the United States had sanctions on Iran since 1979. Didn't make any difference whatsoever, right? In the famous quotation of Ayatollah Khomeini, America could not do a damn thing, right? But once you brought the Europeans in, and then the Chinese and the Russians kind of follow, you had effective international sanctions on Iran that made the Iranians have to think about, how are we going to confront this challenge to the development of our nuclear capabilities? Don't say weapons, because, but the nuclear infrastructure. And so the EU with America, I think, can be a very powerful force. But I think we're seeing right now in the Syrian crisis that the EU without America can't do much of anything, right? You know, the refugee crisis that was spawned by the Syrian civil war, but not limited to it. I mean, there are refugees coming through Libya. There are refugees coming from other countries besides Syria through the Syrian channels. Is a huge, is having, as we know, a huge effect on Europe, and the Europeans can't do anything about it. These are very powerful states. The French army, the British army. It's amazing that they can't get something together to do something about Syria without the United States. And so it really is quite remarkable that the EU, as rich and powerful as it is, doesn't seem to be able to do anything about a situation that is having an enormous and direct negative impact on Europe.
I'm glad you asked that question, and particularly at this time, as all of us, at least those of us who vote, look to November and the elections. With respect to the United States and the Middle East, I think it was Gamal Abdel Nasser, a couple of years after the 67 war came to the belated conclusion, that the United States held all the cards in the Middle East. And he begun, not very successfully, a rapprochement with the United States government, which was ultimately cemented by his successor, Anwar Sadat. Whether it's militarily, economically, politically, culturally, we are pretty much the only big player. Moreover, if you go to the Middle East, and I can't speak for Iran, but I know the United States is very popular among the Iranian people, but if you talk to Arabs, they all look to us. They may not like what we do all the time. They may think we're too hesitant, we're too aggressive, but at the end of the day, it's us they're talking about. They don't talk about the Russians, certainly don't talk about the Chinese, and they hardly ever talk about the EU unless it's a business deal. That's where the EU can be players, and that's where they can be a very helpful complement to what the United States might want to do in the region. If you look at how this Iran deal came together, the EU, Germany, or the EU, France, and Britain tried, and it didn't work. When the United States said, we're willing to step in and play seriously, when we sent the signal, by the way, to the Russians and the Chinese, if you join us in these sanctions, we will make an effort to negotiate an end to the nuclear program in Iran. That's how we got them on board, and only we could do that. So I think we have heard a lot of rhetoric about or from the various candidates, but at the end of the day, the United States must have a policy, and it may be one where we're not going to step into this bear trap, but we'll be the most decisive power in the Middle East for the foreseeable future, and I think even the Iranians recognize that too.
Immediately prior to the revolution of 1979, Iran was an ally of the United States. And then the revolution came, and then the taking of the American hostages in Tehran, and then the two countries became enemies. At that time, the slogan of the Islamic Republic, the slogan of the revolution was no East, no West, but the Islamic Republic. In other words, the Iranians wanted to pursue a foreign policy based on balancing the interests of the West as well as the interests of the Soviet Union. That is the kind of policy that I believe Iran should pursue today. But unfortunately, because Iran and the US do not have normal relations, Russia has taken great advantage of that vacuum, and Iran has become too dangerously close to the Russians, not only politically, but militarily. This is not something that I believe is good for Iran. It is not something that is good for Central Asia and South Caucasus, and I definitely don't think it is good for the United States. And I hope that somehow Iran can go back to the days where they had a balanced foreign policy, not all the way toward the West, as it was under the Shah's days, and not all the way toward Russia, which is today in terms of balance. But Russia is an important player in Iran, and I believe is a very important player in Syria.
Backed by popular demand.
So, Greg, you made a very, very good case for sort of what is going on in this regional crisis. And in your view, the idea that Saudi Arabia is not acting in a sectarian way, if anything, is having to act against sectarianism. But if I could just mention a couple of examples. First of all, in your piece, you suggested, well, they supported Ayat Alawi in the Iraqi elections, and he's a Shia, so they must not be sectarian after all. How can they support a Shia? But of course, Alawi, who is a secular Shia, which means really no Shia at all, was at the head of a party where some 95% of its members were Sunni. I think if there was ever a Sunni party in Iraq during the 2010 elections, it was Iraqiyya, because that's where all the Sunnis are. There's one other Sunni party up in Saladin, and that was it was kind of a more religious Sunni party in Saladin, but otherwise, all Sunnis, it was all in Iraqiyya. So I think there's a bit of a sleight of hand when you said, well, they're supporting Alawi, therefore if they can support a Shia, they're not sectarian. Secondly, you mentioned that they do not have armies elsewhere. You know, they don't have a Quds force, you know, unlike the Iranians who are interfering in a number of places. But I do recall distinctly that when there was a chance that Bahrain would somehow, with their Sunni royal family, would be overthrown by a sort of Shia uprising, Saudi Arabia did not hesitate to send in ground forces. And for someone like me from the old Eastern Europe, I remember the days when the Soviet Union would recruit Poles and Hungarians to help them invade Czechoslovakia. So the Saudis went up to the Gulf states and recruited a number of the Emirates to participate in really what was an effort to put down a Shia uprising. And Pakistanis, whatever. But the real thing that I have trouble explaining in Saudi foreign policy, unless you bring in the concept of a sectarian approach, is precisely their approach to Iraq. All right, the United States does something they didn't want us to do. And you're absolutely right about that. They told us don't do it, and we did it. That is, we invaded Iraq, and we took a Sunni-led country. And Saddam was the last Sunni leader. Now, there are many Sunnis in Iraq who said, well, we don't know where he came from. We think it was Mars or Jupiter. But, we didn't like him any more than you did. But, in fact, the Ba'athist Party of Iraq under Saddam Hussein was a repository it was the way by which the 20% Sunnis ruled the country. So the Saudis, we go in, we flip it from being Sunni-led to Shia-led. The Saudis aren't happy with this. They don't establish an embassy. They don't give any economic assistance. They oppose all types of assistance from other countries. They made clear to the Kuwaitis that they should try to hold on to the Saddam era sanctions to kind of make it tough on the new Shia-led government. I mean, for the Shia-led government in Iraq to be living under the sanctions that were imposed against Saddam Hussein was a little odd, but that's the way it was in the UN for a long time. And by all accounts, Saudis really pressed for that. And then they complain that somehow the Iranians are gaining influence in that country. See, this is proof that these Iraqis are just sort of Iranian stooges who are really all part of a sectarian Shia design. Yet I think what I'm trying to drive at is I think you can make a case for Saudi policy having nothing to do with state policy and everything to do with a sectarian approach to its northern neighbor that has actually made the sectarian issues worse in Iraq. I would conclude also with the fact that Saudi Arabia has completely dropped out of the fight against ISIS. They're much more interested in dropping ordnance on Houthi villages than they are on ISIS. And their explanation for why there's an ISIS, a blood-curdling, bloodthirsty, extreme Wahhabi, extreme Sunni organization, lopping off people's heads, etc. Their explanation for that is that Nouri al-Maliki didn't give the Sunnis enough ministerial portfolios. If only it had been nicer to the Sunni community, there wouldn't be an ISIS. That's a bad enough explanation, but then the question of how do you get rid of ISIS? Well, you can't do it militarily. You got to get rid of the 12er Shia Bashir al-Assad, and once you get rid of him, then ISIS will go away. So all of these things strike me, the only kind of common denominator I can put into this is a kind of sectarian approach. So I would like to see that refuted. I'd love to hear it refuted, and I'd love to hear that the Saudis are simply acting in the vein of traditional statecraft.
Professor Gauss.
I think that a lot of the problems with American policy in the region has been our acceptance of this sectarian notion, our over-acceptance of this sectarian notion as a shortcut for understanding all of this. And I want to be absolutely clear about this. The Saudis exploit sectarianism. Of course they do. The Iranians exploit sectarianism as avenues for achieving power. There's no question about that. But sectarian identity is a constant. There have always been Sunnis and Shia in the Middle East, forever. And there have been other time periods, unlike this time period, where sectarianism has not been the driver of politics, and it's not been the driver of alliances, right? The Saudis and the Shah didn't particularly like and trust each other, but they both disliked the Ba'athist regime in Baghdad, right? A Sunni regime, as we constantly say now, the Sunni regime of Saddam Hussein, right? A Sunni regime in Baghdad. The Saudis didn't like them more, okay? Gamal Abdel Nasser was a good Sunni, and he was the biggest enemy of Saudi Arabia in the 50s and 60s. So the sectarianization of politics right now is, I think, a byproduct of the collapse of state authority in these places, most predominantly Iraq, which we helped to cause. We helped to do that. Right? So I think that Saudi policy, it's hard to say, well, it's not sectarian, it's balance of power, because sectarianism and balance of power politics can both explain the specific actions, right? They can both explain the specific actions. But what I rely on is a longer view of how the Saudis have conducted their foreign policy, and frankly, how the Iranians have conducted their foreign policy, right? In which sectarianism has been a tool and not a driver. It seems to me that the Saudis made an enormous mistake by leaving Iraq open to Iranian influence. And I know senior Saudis share that view. They thought the king was wrong, King Abdullah, and that they should have been in Baghdad throwing money at Iraqi politicians just the way the Iranians were. And that was a bad mistake. But I think that if Saudi policy in Iraq were completely sectarian, okay, then they wouldn't have backed Iyad Alawi. Because how can you trust a Shia? If sectarianism drives your view of things, any Shia, even one who says he's not really Shia, he's really secular, they're only practicing taqiyya. Right? Right. Is when, yeah. Well, right, we can get into that later. And there were other Iraqi Sunni politicians they could have backed, like the Muslim Brotherhood in Iraq, like Salah Mutlaq, and they didn't. They saw Alawi, I think they saw Alawi as a guy who could put together an effective coalition, maybe because he was a Shia, who could challenge what they saw as Iranian allies, right? Yeah. Right. But he wasn't their boy the way Alawi was. And so I think that the main driver of Saudi policy is not sectarianism. The Bahrain thing, you can say they're Sunnis supporting Shia. I would say it was one monarch supporting another monarch. Because one of the things the Saudis were absolutely dead set on in the Arab Spring is no monarchy is going to fall. You know, they couldn't and didn't need to do much for the Moroccans. But the Jordanians got billions of dollars during 2011 to help keep them afloat. And the troops were sent in to Bahrain, and money was sent to the Sultan of Oman, who was having, you know, what for Oman seemed like huge problems in compared to most other places where a couple of demonstrations. So you can, if you want to frame and explain Saudi policy by sectarianism, you can do it. But I think you have to ignore a lot of other elements. You have to ignore the other equities that the Saudis have, pro-monarchy, balance of power stuff, and I think you have to ignore the longer history of the way the Saudis have conducted their policies. Now, do the Saudis like the Iranians? No, they do not. Do the Wahhabis in Central Arabia like Shia? No, they do not. There's no question about that. Do the Iranians like the Saudis? No, they do not.
Yes, we do.
Oh, yes, they love
Absolutely.
them. They love them, and the love is unrequited, which makes it even worse, right? When but I think it's a mistake for us to see the Saudis as pursuing a foreign policy driven by sectarianism. And if we see them that way, then there really isn't any, you know, we have even less reason to cooperate with them, frankly.
I think I don't want to get into
Gary was a man on the ground. He should tell us. Am I wrong? Does sectarianism drive?
I would not say it's a driver. And as you indicated, there have been periods of history of the Middle East where it just was not a factor. Be that as it may, today it is, and we shouldn't deny it. Is it the driving factor? You could probably argue it. I really support the outline or the framework that you presented early on about the breakdown in governing institutions. It was almost inevitable when you have either monarchies or military dictatorships, and very little difference between the two. When these started to break down, where could the people turn? What are the competing political philosophies in the Middle East right now? Where are the John Locke's, Adam Smith's, Tom Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton's? Ain't there. There's nothing. It's just a blank slate. And it shouldn't be surprising that as these institutions began to break down, society began to turn to what they had, which in the Middle East is sectarian affiliation or tribal affiliation. You mentioned Libya. Yeah, 100% of the country basically is Sunni, but they're not all the same tribe. There are many competing tribes. There are probably at least 50, if not more, and they've pretty much broken down along tribal lines. If you go to the Arabian Peninsula and you meet with ministers of the interior, what are their jobs? They don't run the national parks. They monitor tribes. That's pretty much their whole job, especially in Saudi Arabia.
And in Saudi Arabia, Shia.
And that's Shia, and maybe a few scattered others around there. In Oman, probably the most stable and peaceful of all the countries in the Middle East today, that's what they do. They monitor the tribes for fear of ideologues, demagogues, preying upon this very sensitive issue of sectarian affiliation or tribal affiliation. It is still there below the surface, and it's happened to erupt now because institutions are crumbling and they have nowhere else to turn. When we see political philosophies emerge from the region that present governing alternatives, setting aside religion, genuine governing alternatives, whether it's socialism or communism, free enterprise, whatever it is, in the case of the Arab world, not including Iran, if it's Arab, not Sunni or Shia, and it seems like it might work, you'll see people lining up behind it. And you'll see Sunni and Shia standing in the same line.
I think I agree that sectarianism is not the cause of the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I also agree that Iran and Saudi Arabia use sectarianism to push their agenda. But having said all of this, I'm going to repeat again, there is much more evidence supporting that the Saudis support a much more sectarian policy, foreign policy, than does Iran. And I believe the Saudis have succeeded in portraying themselves to represent the so-called Sunni world. They do not. There are 4 major schools of thought in Sunniism. And in one of them, the Wahhabis are the latest version of the Salafi movement. And if you look
Closer to the mic, Mohsen.
And if you look at the population of the Islamic world, only about 20% of them are Arab. The rest of them are non-Arab. And if you look at the Sunni population, the Wahhabis are no more, and I'm being very generous because of that baklava, being very generous, no more than 30 to 40 million of them. They do not represent the Sunni world. The Sunniism that the Turks represent, that Gamal Abdel Nasser represents, is a majority version of the Sunni world. And there is a fundamental difference between the Salafi, Wahhabi, Sunniism, and the rest. And that is anti-Shiism is a central component of that ideology. Anti-Sunniism is not a central component of the Islamic revolution in Iran. That is a reality. And therefore, the Saudis know the only way they can defeat Iran in the Middle East is to turn this power struggle between them into a sectarian war so that all Sunnis come to their defense against Iran. What happened in Lebanon, what happened in Bahrain had nothing to do with Sunni-Shia conflict. It had to do with one simple fact. Less than 15% of the Sunni population control 85% of the Shiite population. The same people who are trying to overthrow the Assad regime because he represents a minority are supporting the monarchy in Bahrain that is suppressing 85%. So what happened when there was an uprising? The Saudi Arabian armed forces with their tanks went to Bahrain and they suppressed the movement. Their army today, their air force today is inside Yemen, and they're doing this. The point I'm trying to make, because the Saudis don't have a model of governance to represent to the Islamic world, because they don't, and because Iran does, no matter how flawed it is a model. The Saudis don't have that model, and therefore, I agree with Ambassador Kresil that they have to push a sectarian line. That's the only way they can succeed, and I hope they fail.
Mohsen, let me correct one thing you said about the uprising in
Please
Syria.
do not, because nobody
I'm
will
sorry,
correct
I didn't have as much baklava as you did. You said that those who rose up against Assad in Syria did so because he was an Alawi minority representing a small percentage of the population. That is not why the people of Syria rose up in March 2011. They rose up against 41 years of oppressive dictatorship, torture, and a police state, okay? And in fact, there were many Alawis who participated in that original phase of the uprising.
Danny, you misunderstood me.
I quoted
What
you.
I said those people who say,
Speak into the mic so we can hear you.
I wasn't talking about why there was an uprising. I said the same people who say we should overthrow Assad regime because he represents a minority.
I see.
I
Okay.
did not say the cause
you.
of the uprising, the beginning reason for the uprising in Syria was that people were sick and tired of Assad's dictatorial, despotic regime, the same way they were sick and tired of Hosni Mubarak, the same way they're sick and tired of all petro dictators and little dictators and permanent presidents. It's the same reason. What I was talking about is that people in the West, people in the Middle East, who keep talking about overthrowing Assad because he represents a minority. When it comes to Bahrain, they're silent.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Okay, we have a question.
Can I just add
Please,
one other
Greg.
thing? I'm just not buying this idea that the Saudis bear, an enormous share of the responsibility for the sectarianization of the current conflicts in the Middle East. If you can point to me one single militia that Iran supports outside of Palestine that's Sunni, then maybe I'll say, oh yeah, it's the Saudis. It's all the Saudis' fault. It seems to me that the Iranians, they don't talk sectarianism for the very reason that you state, because they're trying to transcend sectarianism. But when it comes to the actual fighting in these places where there are civil wars, the Iranians they're not more sectarian than the Saudis. They are as sectarian as the Saudis.
I can answer your question by asking you a question. You identified one case. I can identify two cases, actually. Iran supports Hamas, and Iran supports Islamic Jihad. Both are Palestinian.
Both fighting Israelis.
Doesn't matter. The question he asked me, he didn't qualify.
I said outside of Palestine.
Well, no, I'll get to. And here is the question I have for you. At least in Palestine, I can show you a case where Iran has sided with a supported a non-Shiite. I gave you the example of Armenia versus Azerbaijan. That's a second case.
State-to-state politics.
Well, everything I say you qualify. But here is the question I have for you. You identified one case of Iran supporting a non-Sunni.
Closer to the mic, Mohsen.
You identified one case of where Iran supported a non-Shiite group. The question for you, identify one case that Saudi Arabia has supported a Shiite group. One. I rest my case because you cannot.
No, I agree.
That's 100% in my support.
It's 1 versus 0.
That's 100%.
So one versus 0.
That's the way you win the World Cup. You score 1 point and you win. I won. Thank you very much.
So my question is to the ambassador about his point about the succession in Saudi Arabia. I think this is a problem now when we move from the first generation of the sons of Abdulaziz, the founder of Saudi Arabia, to the next generation. As you said, that Mohammed bin Salman, the deputy crown prince, now is controlling most of the country. He's trying to dominate the scene, marginalizing the crown prince, Mohammed bin Naif, who has also, as you said, experience in security and intelligence. Taking all this into consideration, and Mohammed bin Salman attempts to convince the West that he is the guy for the job, especially after decreasing the authorities of the religious institutions in Saudi Arabia, the recent ones, and his recent, Vision 2030 about having, more freedom, more transparency, less dependence on oil. So, do you think that at the near future, the Saudi regime will be at risk of who is going to be the king of Saudi Arabia? Because as soon as bin Salman is the king, then the kingdom will be confined to to that branch of the Saudi family, to the sons of Mohammed bin Salman. So do you think that Mohammed bin Naif, Muta' bin Abdul Aziz, the head of the National Guards in Saudi Arabia, will do kind of any coalition against the Mohammed bin Salman, trying to get him away from the kingdom? And do you think that this is a good opportunity for the U.S. to intervene to try to have another regime in Saudi Arabia? Or does the U.S. see the interest only with the House of Saud? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ambassador Grappo and perhaps Professor Gauze could both address this.
Right now, if you could take a vote within the Assaud family, I think Mohammed bin Naif would probably get overwhelming support over Mohammed bin Salman. He's just more experienced, more respected, been around a long time. He's earned his stripes. Whereas Mohammed bin Salman, I think I met him once or twice, and he sat very quietly in his father's office and never said a word. So he is pretty inexperienced. enormously ambitious, and I think that's a bit off-putting for the Assaud family. Nevertheless, if you see what he's doing, he's well, I wouldn't say quietly, but he's very clearly exerting more and more control, even outside the economic sphere where he was given control by his father. He's probably the one most behind the Saudi campaign in Yemen. With respect to the United States, first I'll back up and say many careers within the State Department have been destroyed by trying to predict the next king. So ain't going there. I can tell you who has a better chance, but it's like picking the next pope or maybe picking the next supreme leader in Iran. You know, it'll happen. We'll have to see who it is. I think as time progresses, you know, we will get more familiar with Mohammed bin Salman and he with us. And so we may become more comfortable. The one common theme among the Assaud, starting from Abdulaziz Assaud, the founder of the modern Saudi state, until Salman, is the critical importance of the relationship with the United States. I mean, I know the president in his Atlantic article referred to them as a free rider. I mean, they spent a lot of money. They trained their army. They've done a lot of things, but they're never going to have sufficient critical mass to defend their country against, say, someone the size of Iran, or back during the Cold War, the Soviet Union. Not that they necessarily faced that kind of threat. They're mostly concerned about protecting Assaud family rule. And that's why you don't see Saudi forces deployed very far afield. Next door in Bahrain, which basically meant driving across the bridge. And that was it. So I would say the United States would have to be very, very cautious about inserting itself. We never have in succession. It's one of the things we quite honestly never talked about. It's just something we wouldn't talk about. And any more than, well, I guess that rule may have been violated, that a public official, a leading public official in a foreign government would come out and endorse a candidate for the American presidency. I know Netanyahu violated that, but for the most part, most countries around the world respect that. But nevertheless, the question remains, we're moving to the next generation in the Assaud family, and a lot of people are feeling a little bit uncomfortable with it. They like bin Nayef, but nevertheless, what would that mean? And by the way, I don't think he has any sons. He has 4 daughters. So what happens after bin Nayef is kind of anyone's guess. Greg, do you want to have some thoughts?
Yeah, I just, if you had asked, quote unquote, Saudi watchers 5 years ago to name possible successors who would become king later, no one would have mentioned Mohammed bin Salman. So it's a very fluid situation, as Ambassador Grappo pointed out. I just reiterate that the absolute worst thing that the United States could do would be to pick a candidate. I think that would probably destroy that person's chances. But you're right that the Al Saud are concerned about this, because the one time that I think that the Saudi regime was at its most vulnerable was in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when there was a real struggle for power within the family between then King Saud and then Crown Prince Faisal. And it nearly brought the regime down. And so I do think that this is something that is in the living memory of some of the older princes, and so they want to avoid it. But I also think that you know, you have some of these younger princes who didn't live through that period. And the question is, will they be willing to, I think I must have said something that drove Musson out. But so now I've lost my train of thought. So yeah, this to me, I think, is the biggest threat to the Saudis, right? People think the Saudis are an unstable regime. They're not. They've been remarkably stable, right? During the Arab Spring, they were the major Arab country with the least public demonstrations. Some demonstrations in the Shia areas of the eastern province, most of those kicked off by things that happened in Bahrain, not in Saudi. So the The Saudis are actually a pretty stable regime, but if they fight at the top, then that opens up all sorts of possibilities for mobilization from below. And I think that any scenario where you talk about the instability in the Saudi regime begins with fighting at the top.
It is now 4 o'clock, folks. We have lost one of our panelists, not permanently. He just has a Skype interview. He's in demand. You know this. He, in the middle of the panel, he got a request for a Skype interview. We were able to accommodate him because of this extraordinary building that we have. He's in the green room right now, Skyping with God somewhere halfway across the world, probably. But I just want to say, on behalf of the Center for Middle East Studies, what a tremendously stimulating day this has been of discussions across a real range of issues. You know, our first two conferences dealt with individual countries. Our first one was on Syria. Second conference was on Egypt. Although those are huge and complicated countries to deal with in one day, it focuses the mind when you have one country. For this one, we really wanted to, although Iran is in many ways the nerve center of the analysis, we wanted to take a bigger cut at exactly what you laid out, Greg, in your PowerPoint, the Cold War, a region in crisis, the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. What does it mean for the wider Middle East, and what does it mean for U.S. policy? We've heard a real range of perspectives on these questions today. Lots of food for thought, contending and contrasting arguments, particularly on the first panel. For those who missed it, the video will be available soon. There were some intellectual fireworks. Always, never a dull moment when Mohsen Milani is in the room. But this was a really stimulating and fabulous series of discussions today. I want to thank all of our speakers, particularly Professor Gregory Gause and Professor Mohsen Milani, the two who flew in from other cities. I also want to thank the institution that Mohsen Milani directs, the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies at the University of South Florida, for being our partner in this event today with the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies here at the University of Denver. I want to thank Ambassador Christopher Hill, Ambassador Gary Grappo, and Professor Nader Hashemi as well for serving as our interlocutors with our two keynote speakers today. And as Nader mentioned in his opening remarks today, for those of you who have not attended other events of our Center for Middle East Studies but would like to, please see Tiffany Wilk in the back. She can put you on our email list. You can find us on Facebook and follow us and our events that way. And we look forward to having a number of events in this extraordinary room. What a beautiful and spectacular view there is. Please enjoy it before we leave. Ambassador Hill, did you want to say anything in closing? Thank you very much for coming, and good afternoon.